I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And this is our 2016 Olden Days Update podcast, where we're just going to come back to a few little points of interest that were left hanging during the year in our series of regular podcasts. Ghostbusters, which was our second episode of the Olden Days. We mentioned there was a new film coming out this year. A franchise reboot and universe reboot, and we were saying perhaps when it came out we would watch it and judge it and see if it was any good in any ways. Well, it came out in the cinemas, it came out on movie on demand services, and I've seen it, I think, on DVD in Tesco ready for Christmas, and we haven't seen it in any of those media because we took the decision not to pay to see it, didn't we?
Yes, a lot of people seem to have been quite enjoying it. A lot of people have been slagging it off because they like the original and they don't want anything new. I've been trying to keep an open mind. It's just that from the trailers and the comments that I've read, I think it looks like a load of twaddle.
Yes, I tell you what decided me. Oh yes, I don't really want to pay for it. I've read some of the quotes and jokes on the movie database, and I thought, Jesus, don't want to bother paying for this. Same old regurgitated, supposed to be funny but isn't 21st century filmmaking, and I suspect that's very much what the film is like.
Humour is subjective, it goes without saying. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. It's just that my opinion is that it doesn't look like something I'd enjoy, and so is yours, isn't it?
So it'll be interesting to see it when it does come on the telly. They sometimes come quite quickly nowadays, maybe Christmas after next or something. Somebody might decide to premiere it. We'll certainly watch it and see what it's like. Under those circumstances, we're not going to pay for it though. We're outside the parameters of paying for just having television, which you have to do nowadays, of course. So the jury's still out on that one. I'm sure it's quite incorrect of Cartman on South Park to say Ghostbusters not funny, chicks ruined it. But I'm sure there's plenty of other stuff in it that may well ruin it instead. It should be quite irrelevant, the gender of the Ghostbusters.
I wasn't even thinking about that.
No, the first thing that pops into mind if you read people arguing about it and so on, really. It should be a non-issue in a world with no sexism, but we don't live in that world, and probably never will. Alvin and the Chipmunks also had a new film that we hadn't seen, was released before we did our podcast, wasn't it?
Can't remember now.
I think it was, but you hadn't got the DVD. But then, sometime after our Chipmunks podcast, you got the DVD of Alvin and the Chipmunks 4, The Road Chip, and you watched it, and then you watched it with me, and we had some thoughts about it.
Yes, I didn't mind it. I do think it's rather unnecessary. We did say about Chipwrecked, it's really inferior to the other two films, but what I said I did like about it, because it's true, is that it's the 6 of them, the Chipmunks and Chipheads, all hanging out doing stuff, which I do like. The new film, The Road Chip, isn't that. The Chipheads aren't in it very much, and it's about the Chipmunks going and trying with their potential stepbrother to stop Dave from proposing to his girlfriend, and a man who works on the aeroplane chasing them because he's annoyed them, which sounds very silly, and it is. I actually didn't mind it though. I quite like their new co-star. The character's name is Miles. I don't know the name of the actor. I thought some of the characterization was lacking. The 3 chipmunks were very much of one mind, it seemed to me. They didn't have their individual characteristics as much as they ought to. So I wouldn't exactly say I liked it, but I certainly didn't dislike it.
I remember an interesting comment you came out with after watching it was if they do make another one, they really need to include the new status quo, which is the Chipmunks and their extended family, Dave's new woman and Miles. Otherwise, you'd feel even more emotionally cheated than you do after he loses the girl from the first film, who was called Claire.
That's right. It's all about them coming to terms with the idea of having Miles as a stepbrother because they get to know each other and understand each other, and Miles is a jerk to start out with, but then it turns out it's because of various issues and he actually really wants to have a loving family. So, yes, they do need to stand by that understanding and love for each other that they've reached. It's very silly, the first film. There's this love interest and then they can't really be bothered having her in the next one, but this time they've really put a lot into it.
They couldn't really be bothered having Dave in the second one.
That's very true.
All that stuff they do with Toby instead. But yeah, if you take anything away from Road Trip and then come back and they don't revisit any emotional investment you've given it, you're going to hate the next film, which is why people hate Alien 3, who are very emotionally invested in aliens.
Because everyone died when we weren't looking, didn't they?
Yeah, that's exactly it, yeah. No, we don't like that.
And so did Sarah Connor in Terminator 3.
Yes.
And that woman called Annie in Candyman 3. It's always happening.
It's always rather a cop-out and stops any emotional investment in the previous thing really being what it should be.
So maybe if there is another Chipmunks movie, Miles and his mother will have died when we weren't looking.
Probably. I thought it was pretty pathetic as movies go, but then that's par for the course nowadays. Road Trip I'm back onto now. I enjoyed Jennifer Coolidge, Stifler's mom, being her usual amusing self, flirting with young chipmunks and characters she shouldn't be flirting with. I thought they could have done with one more appearance from her. They had two. I thought they could have snuck in three and got the most out of her. Very funny.
Yes, that was good, and I did find it interesting that she was clearly homage to Miss Miller, voiced by Dodie Goodman, if that's her name.
Yes, that's right.
Good, I remembered correctly.
From Grease movies.
The late Dodie Goodman always did a very good job as the voice of Miss Miller, who starts out as the Chipmunks' neighbour, who's supposed to be looking after them in the Chipmunk adventure, and gets duped into not looking after them under different circumstances. Miss Miller gets tricked into thinking Dave wants the Chipmunks to go to Europe with him. Jennifer Coolidge gets tricked into thinking that they're still in the house because they put some squirrels there in their clothes.
Yeah, I really did come away from that thinking, well, the first two films, Chipmunks and the Squeakquel, were really very good, pleasant surprises, very good quality movies. And then the other two, it just goes to show you don't need to keep coming back and doing it, and the quality is not going to remain so high.
It's all about the money.
So there we are. Those movies are what they are, and there they'll always be. Finders Keepers was something we talked about a few months ago, and we left you a bit up in the air about what was going to happen in the final series of Finders Keepers, which was showing on Challenge at the time. And the result was that the series of 8 episodes did in fact end in a 4-all draw for Neil Buchanan and Diane Dale. But of course, everyone got to come in and say goodbye at the end of episode 8 of the series.
You were crying fix, I seem to remember.
I think it was a fix, don't you? To try and neaten things up.
Well, I don't know, but what the listeners might find slightly interesting is that we have started watching Gladiators on Challenge since we talked about Diane Dale and Finders Keepers, and we quite like her as Jet the Gladiator, don't we?
Yes, we do, and it's a shame that she was injured after a few series of Gladiators and then was forced to be demoted to Finders Keepers. The show never really managed to use her in the correct way and find a good place for her. We say in our podcast, And obviously Diane is in her element as Jet on Gladiators.
She's always having lots of fun doing Gladiators, and we'll always call her Diane, so it's like Wolf and Lightning and Saracen and Diane.
Yes, because she's our friend now. And we really must, in fact, podcast about Gladiators and Ice Warriors. So if I'm coming back to listen to this at the end of 2017 and see what updates we need to do then, and we haven't done that podcast yet, let's do it. Gladiators and Ice Warriors. Fantastic. See why those are grouped together very easily when we talk about them. I was wondering when we'd finished watching that Neil and Diane series of Finders Keepers if it was a bit of a shame that Scottish TV had decided, well, let's not bother making any more, having picked it up for that one series, or if really the show had run its course and had lost its way a bit. And, well, I think the existing Finders Keepers is enough to keep anyone going, really, and it doesn't really hit the mark that Scottish TV series, so perhaps it was best to call it a day there. And it's always interesting to look back on and judge harshly. In the Animals of Farthing Wood podcast, we're at very interesting stages in reading the book series between us. Perhaps Rosie would like to tell you now something that she got for Christmas.
Well, I got the complete 3 series of The Animals of Farthing Wood on DVD. I'm not sure who gave me that Christmas present.
It was Santa, wasn't it?
Oh, yes, of course. And I was very glad to have that. I haven't actually watched it yet. We only watched it on our old video quite recently, but I'll watch it fairly soon and I'll enjoy it because I like The Animals of Farthing Wood TV series. When we podcasted about it, I had started to read the second book in the series, In the Grip of Winter, and I had read The Animals of Farthing Wood and found it really rather boring. And I was commenting on how interesting, I'm not sure what the right word is, remarkable it is, notable, something like that, that it's pretty much exactly the same as the TV show, except the TV show makes it a lot more interesting for me. I think the books are quite badly written. The characters don't really have any character, and as a rule I find them quite boring, although I did give 3 stars on Goodreads to Fox's Feud and The Fox Cub Bold, because even though I thought they were still badly written and had far too many adverbs and silly words instead of said, very often together, I did find them more engaging and the stories more interesting.
I came back to read The Animals of Farthing Wood, the first book, after about 10 years, as you may remember from the podcast, and I did remember why I used to like it so much as a youngster and why I used to really engage with it and find it easier to come to terms with in my mind a lot more than the TV series. It does seem to me a lot surer of its tone, is how I put it on Goodreads. I always felt I knew where I was emotionally with the book a lot more than the TV series. So I did give it 4 stars on Goodreads as a piece of slight nostalgia for me, but also compared to the other books I've been reading at the moment, far better. Perhaps I was coloured slightly in my assessment, but I did still enjoy it. And I do think In the Grip of Winter and Fox's Feud are very coherent sequels and do a good job continuing the story, although I do think it doesn't really need sequels, and it does make White Deer Park come across as something of a false haven, all these various troubles that happen there. But if it had just been the harsh winter and the little war with the other Fox tribe in the Grip of Winter and Fox's Feud, and then at the end of Fox's Feud, it seems like it should be the end. The animals are saying, let's be integrated now, let's stop thinking ourselves as a separate entity, and now we are the animals of White Deer Park. And that's really where their emotional and practical journey should come to an end. Now, it's fair enough to have Fox Cub Bold just to finish off mopping up Bold's adventures, although I found that book extremely bleak and didn't like it, and I think without the comparing and contrasting with what's going on back in White Deer Park and Fox's Feud, which we talked about in the podcast, the book doesn't seem to have any point beyond, well, life's crap and you're just going to die in a ditch at the end of it. It was more useful, I think, as something to juxtapose with the Fox's Feud story back in White Deer Park. So that's one thing I do prefer on the telly.
I think maybe you find the Fox Cub Bowl more disturbing than I do because you actually engage with the series and the characters. When you're talking about whether Badger's alive and what characters are doing what in the books, I sort of don't really care. I find it very emotionless, personally. But of course, different people engage with different things. Sometimes I say, well, this is a really good book. Would you like to read this book? And you don't like it. It's The Siege of White Deer Park, isn't it? We both gave 1 star to on Goodreads because it was a load of crap.
Yes, it is, in fact, utterly redundant to come back after the Fox Cub Bowl to the Siege of White Deer Park with the giant cat stalking around killing everything.
We get enough of that in real life.
Yeah, this happens in Oh God. But what's really terrible about the Siege of White Deer Park, the book, is that it doesn't have a proper ending. They don't actually do anything. Nothing that's happened in the book the animals have tried to do has any point, because the cat just decides to go off and mate at the end. And it's been an utterly pointless journey. If you've invested in the journey, you need to see some sort of things coming to fruition, and they don't. Perhaps that's partly why it wasn't fully adapted into a storyline in the Animals of Farthingwood TV series. It's the only book that wasn't, apart from the prequel book, obviously. And they did use the aspect of the wildcat, as we mentioned, in the Weasel storyline in the 3rd series of TV show, but it was very much toned down and changed and adapted, and obviously it was decided for whatever reason that having the giant cat killing everything in White Deer Park wasn't going to add anything to the series.
Especially since they were toning down the deaths and reducing the number.
And I guess if they did want to get everything into one more series and they wanted the rats from Battle for the Park as the main antagonists, then the cat just wouldn't fit anyway. So they did the best there with the material they'd got.
Gave the weasel something to do.
It's interesting how it says at the beginning of the Siege of White Deer Park, Mole had quite naturally passed away at the end of his reasonable length life during the 3rd winter in White Deer Park. Not the 1st winter, television series makers, the 3rd winter. And that's more like the kind of journey they were taking him on as a main character in the story. So I do prefer that in the book, certainly. But there's plenty of scenes between Badger and Mossy during the last 3 books.
I'm to be known as Mole now, Mossy twittered informatively.
Yes, indeed.
badly written, sorry, calling down, but it is.
And I've now overtaken Rosie, and I'm currently reading the penultimate book, unless you count the prequel, In the Path of the Storm. And I do like to see Badger involved, as he should be, in all the adventures, things that we very much associate with the 3rd series of the TV show are here now. Trey the stag, Plucky the fox, who's Fox and Vixen's great-grandson in the books and grandson in the TV series. And in a bit I was reading recently, Badger and Plucky have a tussle with Trey. You'd never see that on the TV series, would you?
No, because Badger's dead.
Quite. But it's really struck me, they really do give Badger's storylines to Hercule and Shadow. Shadow's the one who gets ill from drinking from the stream, which Badger was doing when Plucky and Trey were involved in that scene. I really see the point of taking Badger out and then just giving his storylines to other Badgers from the TV series. Very, very strange.
Maybe it's because they thought it would be funny if one of them had a Welsh accent.
Well, it could be, but I always hate that decision, and perhaps that really, the Badger thing, is the deciding factor that makes me settle on the side of the books rather than the TV series overall, if I'm being honest.
But I like the TV series better for me. It's taken the good ideas from Colin Dan's books, which he hasn't written particularly well, in my opinion, and made them a bit more interesting and left out the stupid ideas.
So there we are. There's still a lot of mixed feelings about Farthingwood in various media around these parts, and doubtless there always will be. But it certainly always has been, or certainly for a very long time, a prominent part of our lives and growing up experiences. And then finally, I thought we might just mention from the Back to the Future podcast who Mr. Drive-By Shooter actually is.
Yes, you thought perhaps I'd better explain why instead of a drive-by shooter, I said Mr. Drive-By Shooter. Well, it's just a funny joke in our house. Well, I don't know if Jake ever does it actually, but I always call Drive-By Shooters Mr. Drive-By Shooter because there was a very funny Mr. Men cartoon parody joke sketch thing on something like Dead Ringers.
It was Dead Ringers, this one, I think, yes.
Where Mr. Happy ends up on the wrong side of the tracks and he meets people like Mr. Happy Slapper and Little Miss Asbo, who punched and kicked poor Mr. Happy and filmed him on their cameras, which dates it rather. Nowadays they'd use their iPods, or no, you can't do it with an iPod, can you? Their iPhones or
God
something.
knows what you can do it with. You can do it with tablets, I think.
I think you can't do it with an iPod because that's just an MP3 player, but I could be wrong because I'm very old. But anyway, at the end of that sketch, Mr. Drive-By Shooter comes and shoots Mr. Happy and finishes with, oh dear, thought Mr. Happy as he lay bleeding to death. You know the sort of thing. So that's why I think it's funny to call Drive-By Shooters Mr. Drive-By Shooter.
It was a very funny sketch, that, and certainly is worth referencing. And now, hopefully, if you listen to the Back to the Future podcast again, you'll know exactly what it's referencing. I wish I could see that mockumentary about the Mr. Ben show with Mr. Bump complaining he's addicted to painkillers and things. It seems to have gone from YouTube, but it's very funny. So there we are. That should be all the loose ends tied up for now. But when we do this again in a year's time, perhaps we'll have some more loose ends from 2016 to tie up. For instance, how Hey Arnold, the Jungle movie turned out. Should have seen that by then. And perhaps Watership Down 2017 Christmas, which probably will be quite fresh in our minds as we sit and record this late in 2017, unless it's going to be on over New Year. Don't know what we'll do about that, but we'll have to wait and see. And who knows what little questions and queries and things to come back to might pop up during the podcasts in 2017, but we'll soon find out. And now, as promised, let's disclose the arrangements for 2017. Well, we've done awfully well, and actually recorded and released and spent quite some hours editing a podcast every 2 weeks since the 17th of January 2016. Quite a labour of love it's been. Originally I was saying we should do one a month, and then we had so many ideas we wanted to get out in podcasts. It became every other week, and indeed, that was very necessary, because we've had a lot of podcasts we wanted to get through this year, and we've done a lot of them and had a good time doing it. However, we've both agreed that the time has now come to go down to one a month, haven't we?
Yes, it seems to come round rather often, and I'm terribly busy, aren't I? So yes, we thought one a month would be sensible.
I'm always sitting at the laptop chopping out bits of coughing and God knows what else, and people coming to the door with free loo paper.
Bloody nuisance doing this, isn't it?
Yes, so really it's going to make it a complete pleasure, rather than almost complete pleasure, to do it by dropping down to one per month. And we're going to release them on the final Sunday of each month of 2017. And that should take us right up to New Year's Eve 2017, which is going to be a Sunday. I don't know if that'll be our update podcast for the year, or if we'll want to get in a 12th proper podcast and release two in very quick succession. Who knows? But we'll find out in due course. So, do join us again on the final Sunday in January, which will be January the 29th, for our next podcast, which will be on the subject of
various Warner Brothers cartoons, which have been on my mind lately for some reason. There have been some repeats of Tiny Toon Adventures on cable, so we'll talk about that. Animaniacs, the original Looney Tunes, and perhaps some other things they've cropped up in.
Well, that will certainly be interesting and reference a lot of different times and media which you may be familiar with. So until then, thank you for listening to this. Hopefully it's been very interesting. And thank you for joining us for the Olden Days podcast throughout 2016. Until 2017, it's Happy New Year out there.
whatever you are.